September 27, 1968, early morning, Kursk, Soviet Union. It begins like any other day. The square outside the city's main railway station is already filling with people. Commuters hurry to work, students make their way to class, trams arrive one after another, unloading passengers who disappear into the morning crowd. It's a warm September morning, and nothing seems out of the ordinary. Then, everything changes. Without warning, the silence is shattered by a burst of automatic gunfire. At first, few people understand what's happening. Some assume it's a military exercise, others mistake the sound for nearby construction. But within seconds, people begin collapsing onto the pavement. Panic erupts. Pedestrians scatter in every direction, desperately searching for cover, unable to tell where the shots are coming from. Screams echo across the square, drowned out only by another deafening burst of gunfire. In less than a minute, what had been an ordinary morning rush has become the scene of an unimaginable tragedy. "13 people were killed, another 11 were injured. It remains one of the deadliest mass shootings in the history of the Soviet Union. The gunmen were Soviet army deserters, but in the terrible hours that followed, no one knew what had actually happened. Outside the Soviet Union, the story quickly became the subject of speculation. The US-funded broadcaster Voice of America reported the incident as a possible armed uprising, perhaps even a sign that resistance to the Soviet government was beginning to emerge from within the military itself. Given the political climate of 1968, many observers in the West believed they were witnessing the first signs of a military coup. Some even suspected that elements of the Soviet armed forces had turned against the government. But the truth was very different. Today, we're going back to the beginning to uncover what really happened on the blood-soaked September morning and how one of the darkest days in Soviet history unfolded. It all began on the evening of September 26, 1968. Just after nightfall, two Soviet soldiers carrying a suitcase approached apartment building number 1, whose windows overlooked the city's main railway station. They walked inside without drawing attention, climbed to the 4th floor, and knocked on the door of apartment 41, a modest flat overlooking the city's railway station. The door was opened by 38-year-old Tamara Sattarova. She never had a chance to react. The armed soldiers forced their way inside and showed her into the apartment. At that moment, 8 people were inside the small 2-bedroom flat. Tamara, her 2 children, her mother, and several other relatives. What happened next was horrifying. To muffle the sound of the gunfire, one of the soldiers pressed a pillow against his weapon before opening fire on the family. As victims lay wounded on the floor, the second attacker moved through the apartment, killing survivors with the closest iron. Only 3 people were spared: Tamara Sattarova and her 2 young children. They were tied up and locked inside the kitchen. Despite attackers' effort to silence the gunshots, several neighbors heard the shooting. One of them, a woman named Maria, immediately called the police, convinced that someone was firing an automatic weapon inside the building. But no one believed her. According to later witness accounts, the dispatcher assumed she had mistaken the sound of passing motorcycles for gunfire. He told her not to worry and suggested she simply go back to bed. If only the police dispatcher had understood what was happening inside apartment 41. Behind the door, the 2 armed soldiers had just slaughtered an entire family. But their crimes were far from over. What happened that night was only the beginning of a chain of events that, by the following morning, would shock the entire Soviet Union. The attackers were Private Viktor Nikolaevich Korshunov and Yuri Stepanovich Surovtsev, two Soviet army servicemen stationed at a military unit in the Kursk region. The two men knew each other well. They shared more than military service. Both had grown deeply resentful of their lives, consumed by frustration and anger. Over time, they convinced themselves that there was no line they were unwilling to cross. That shared mindset became the foundation of a deadly partnership. According to later accounts, the two would sit together in their barracks, fantasizing about hijacking an airplane, murdering the pilots, and flying wherever they wanted. To understand how these events unfolded, it's worth taking a closer look at Viktor Korshunov. From an early age, those who knew him described him as unusual, violent, and difficult to control. Raised by his mother, he frequently caused trouble throughout his childhood. His father was absent. During Second World War, he had been convinced to collaborate with Nazi Germany and sentenced to prison. After finishing school, Korshunov enrolled at a local college, but his academic career was short-lived. After just 2 years, he was expelled, and in autumn of 1966, he was drafted into the Soviet army. He was assigned to a military unit in Kursk. Unlike many conscripts, Korshunov adapted quickly to military life. Serving in a rifle company, he became highly proficient with small arms and beyond combat, eventually earning a reputation as one of the unit's best marksmen. His performance earned him the prestigious Excellent Soldier of Soviet Army badge, an award reserved for exemplary servicemen. But despite his military success, Korshunov remained isolated. Fellow soldiers kept their distance, describing him as arrogant, withdrawn, and difficult to approach, and from all accounts, he seemed to prefer it that way. The only person Korshunov ever seemed to connect with was Yuri Surovtsev, a young soldier from the Ukrainian city of Kramatorsk. Surovtsev arrived at the unit in March 1967. Unlike Korshunov, he wasn't known for aggression. Those who served with him described him as an emotional immature, easily influenced and highly dependent on stronger personalities. Before being drafted, Surovtsev had been discharged from a regional psychiatric hospital, where he underwent treatment following a nervous breakdown linked to what doctors described as a psychological immaturity. Despite these documented mental health concerns, he was still accepted into Soviet Army's internal troops. His life before military service had also been marked by a failure. He enrolled in college but was expelled because of poor academic performance. There was another striking similarity between the two men. Like Korshunov's father, Surovtsev's father had also served time in prison, so not for a political crime but for armed robbery. Military records painted a troubling picture of Yuri Surovtsev. He was described as highly excitable and emotional sensitive, prone to crying, and inclined to retreat into elaborate fantasies. Just weeks before the massacre, there had already been a warning. During a military exercise, Viktor Korshunov's unit was training at a firing rank when a routine reprimand from his company commander triggered an alarming reaction. Without warning, Korshunov raised his loaded assault rifle, pointed it at his fellow soldiers and declared that he would kill them all before taking his own life. The other servicemen managed to overpower him and wrestle the weapon away. What happened next is difficult to understand. Rather than facing military tribunal or a full psychiatric evaluation, Korshunov was sent to a military hospital for only a few days. Soon afterwards, he returned to his unit and resumed duties, as though nothing had happened. After the tragedy, many would ask the same question: how could such an obvious warning sign have been ignored? So what ultimately pushed Korshunov towards mass murder? According to the official investigation, not long before the attack, he received a letter from his fiancée. It was a farewell letter. She told him she no longer intended to wait for him to return from military service. For Korshunov, the rejection was devastating. Witnesses later said he sank into deep despair, becoming increasingly bitter and obsessed with the idea that his life had no meaning. At first, he spoke openly about suicide, but over time, those thoughts evolved into something far more sinister. He decided that if he was going to die, he wouldn't die alone. To carry out his plan, Korshunov turned to the one person who believed he could rely on, Yuri Surovtsev. Surovtsev was deeply influenced by Korshunov and rarely challenged his ideas. Over time, Korshunov convinced him that the Soviet system had ruined their lives, that they had been betrayed by those in power, and the society itself deserved to be punished. Eventually, the two men began referring to themselves as avengers. In their minds, they were no longer criminals. They believed they were taking revenge on the world for every failure, every disappointment, and every grievance they carried. There was momentary violence fantasies began to turn into concrete plan. After declaring themselves avengers, the two men began searching for a target. Simply committing murder wasn't enough. They wanted an attack so shocking that it would be impossible to ignore. Among the locations they considered were some of Kursk's most important government buildings: the city Communist Party headquarters, the regional police administration, and the prosecutor's office. In the end, they settled on the Communist Party headquarters. The attack was carefully planned. They armed themselves with 2 AK pattern rifles and hundreds of rounds of ammunition. To avoid attracting attention, they hid the weapon inside suitcases, even sewing off the rifle stocks so they would fit. On September 25, 1968, both soldiers deserted their military unit and traveled into Kursk, intending to carry out their plan. But once they reached the city, they realized that the party headquarters was too heavily protected. A police station occupied the same building, and two men knew they would likely be killed before they had chance to carry out their attack. So they abandoned their original plan, not because they had changed their minds, but because they wanted to even greater impact. Just a short distance away stood Kursk main railway station. Korshunov and Surovtsev knew that every morning the square outside the station is filled with commuters, students, railway workers, and ordinary residents beginning their day. It was then they made a decision that defied all logic. Instead of attacking government officials, they chose innocent civilians as their target. All they needed to know was the right vantage point. On the evening of September 26, the two soldiers entered the apartment building at first Vokzalnaya Street, and they made way to apartment 41. Those windows overlooked the crowded station square. To gain control of that apartment, they murdered the family living inside. The crime itself was so brutal it could have been taken from a horror film. The following morning, those same windows would become the firing position from which they opened fire on hundreds of unsuspecting people below. As the horror unfolded, Tamara Satarova cried out, "What are you doing?" One of the deserters answered with a chilling calm, "We are avengers." The two men then told her they would spare the children if she went out, bought them vodka. Tamara had no real choice. Believing it might be the only way to keep children alive, she agreed. She waited until the nearest store opened and left their apartment. On her way, she encountered a local police officer, but terrified that saying anything might provoke the gunman into killing the hostages, she remained silent. By the time she returned, it was already too late. While she was gone, Korshunov and Surovtsev had killed both of her daughters. The details of those murders are exceptionally disturbing, and I'll leave them out. They add nothing to our understanding of what happened, only the cruelty of the crime. Overcome with grief, Tamara threw herself at killers trying to fight them with her bare hands. She never stood a chance. The attackers beat and sexually assaulted her. At one point, Tamara attempted to take her own life, but the deserters stopped her. They locked her inside the bathroom, carried the victims' bodies into the single room, switched on the television, and sat down to drink the vodka she had been forced to buy. On the morning of September 27th, after a night of drinking, the two deserters decided it was time to continue what they had started. At around 8 am, Korshunov and Surovtsov took positions in separate rooms of their apartment. They retrieved their rifles, threw open the window, and prepared to fire into the crowd station square below. Just before the shooting began, Korshunov made an unusual request. He told Surovtsov to switch on the radio and turn the volume up as loud as possible. Moments later the attack began. With several short bursts of gunfire, Korshunov killed 5 people almost immediately. Surovtsov, a less skilled marksman, wounded several others. Panic swept across the square. People ran in every direction, desperately searching for cover. Among those helping civilians escape were Second World War veterans who happened to be nearby. Drawn on their wartime experience, they guided frightened people out of the line of fire. Within minutes, the square was nearly empty, but the gunmen remained at the windows, rifles in hand, scanning for new targets. They didn't have to wait long. At approximately 8:50 am, a prison transport vehicle entered the area carrying 4 detainees from the village of Koshinova who were being transferred to Moscow. The moment the vehicle came into view, Korshunov and Surovtsov opened fire. The driver reacted instantly, steering the transport out of the kill zone into the nearby side street. Even so, the attackers managed to fatally wound a 18-year-old prisoner who died before medical personnel could reach him. An ambulance evacuating victims from the square also came under fire. Fortunately, no one inside the ambulance was killed. Within minutes, the police dispatch center was overwhelmed with calls from terrified witnesses, reporting gunfire at the railway station. Officers from Kiev District Police Department were immediately sent to the scene. What they found was beyond anything they had expected. Bodies lay scattered across the square. The wounded cried out from behind walls, vehicles, and whatever cover they could find. In the confusion, the responding officer didn't immediately realize that they too were being targeted. Following reports from witnesses, police identified the apartment from which the shots were being fired. They rushed into the building and climbed to the 4th floor. But as soon as the gunmen heard footsteps in the hallway, they opened fire through the apartment door. The officers narrowly escaped and were forced to retreat. By then, authorities had begun sealing off the entire station square. The local police force alone wasn't enough to secure the area. Additional troops were called in, including soldiers from the very military unit where Korshunov and Surovtsov had been serving only days earlier. Evacuating wounded presented another challenge. To protect rescue teams from the continuing gunfire, authorities deployed an armored personnel carrier. Moving cautiously from the position to another, the vehicle acted as a mobile shield, allowing medics and rescuers to reach the injured while bullets continued to strike around them. As the siege continued, authorities established a command post inside the same apartment building. Senior officials from the city's police and security service gathered there to coordinate the response. The initial plan was to storm the apartment. Officers in the neighbor flat began drilling a hole through the shattered wall, hoping to pump tear gas inside before launching the assault. But the plan quickly unraveled. Hearing the sound of the drill, the gunmen shouted through the door that they would kill every hostage if anyone attempt to enter. To prove they were serious, they fired another burst of gunfire through the apartment door. The officers had no way of knowing that most of the hostages were already dead. Believing innocent lives were still at immediate risk, they called off the assault. Attempts to negotiate were equally unsuccessful. Major General Sergei Shmagrilov, head of the Regional Public Order Directorate, spent time speaking to the gunmen through the closed door. They made no demands. They showed no interest in negotiating. Around 8 a.m., the deputy commander of the deserters' military unit arrived at the scene. Knowing Korshunov's personality, he chose a different strategy. Instead of trying to reason with Korshunov, he focused on Yuri Surovtsov. By that point, Surovtsov appeared to have fully grasped the consequences of what they had done. Witnesses later described him as emotionally broken and deeply distressed. The commander then gave him an extraordinary order: kill Korshunov. Moments later, Surovtsov turned his rifle on his accomplice. In a state of hysteria, he emptied nearly an entire magazine into Korshunov. Investigators later counted 23 gunshot wounds on his body. Roughly 10 minutes later, officers forced open the apartment door and entered. They found Surovtsov sitting silently against the kitchen wall. He surrendered without resistance.